Hello, this is Chris Allen, Superintendent with Marble Falls ISD, and I wanted to provide a brief finance overview. This presentation should run, at or a little less than 10 minutes, and it intends to try and explain a little bit about Texas public school finance, what that looks like in Marble Falls ISD, and maybe answer some commonly asked questions. For example, around the state of Texas, you'll often hear people ask questions like, how can schools afford a new stadium, but they cannot afford teacher raises? I hope to speak to that. Why do the schools say they need more money if property taxes keep going up? I will talk about property taxes, recapture, and what that looks like across the state of Texas and in Marble Falls ISD. And then finally, speaking of taxes, people want to know why the amount of money they keep paying in taxes increases, but their schools don't have as much money as they wish they did. And so I hope to speak to a number of these issues and give it the Marble Falls ISD context as we go. So let me talk a little bit about how public schools are funded. We typically use money from two buckets of funds. One's called the maintenance and operations budget. And those are funds that take care of our day-to-day operations in the district. Reoccurring cost is a good way of thinking about that. And then we have interest in sinking, and that is how we repay debt usually created by the sale of bonds, and we use those bonds to pay for what we call big ticket items. They're almost always durable, long-lasting items like buses and school buildings. School districts are legally prohibited from using INS money for M&O expenses. So you cannot pass a bond to pay for teacher raises, but you can pass a bond to do high school renovations. So to answer one of the very first questions, how can they afford that stadium but they can't do teacher raises? Well, it's coming out of two buckets of money. And the state will not allow you to use money from the INS bucket to pay for M&O expenses. And they're both separate tax rates. So there's an M&O tax rate, which is actually set by the Texas Education Agency. And then there's an INS tax rate, which is set by local school districts based on the sale of bonds. And so that explains a little bit about why school districts can have money to do some things, but not have resources to do others. Well, let's talk a little bit more about maintenance and operations. So the kinds of things that school districts use that money for is teacher salaries, facilities repairs, bus repairs, child nutrition, utilities, ongoing cost. What would that look like in your everyday house? Your ongoing cost of your house payment, maybe car fuel, groceries, cleaning supplies, utilities, that kind of thing. And then interest in sinking, what would that look like for a school district? Well, we use that when we build new buildings, buy land, do renovations, maybe specific equipment for a particular program. We see this most often in our career technology education where they sometimes need high dollar equipment like welding machines. That would be an appropriate use of interest in sinking funds. To create an analogy or comparison, this is the kind of money that people use when they do a home renovation or buy new appliances for their kitchen. And so that's sort of the difference between M&O and INS. So M&O funds. Our M&O funds come from the general fund, which is most typically tax dollars. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. We do receive some federal grants, some state grants. We receive some activity funds, and we also make a little money in our child nutrition department. And then our INS funds come from the sale of school bonds. That's the debt service, and that's used. And we also get some capital project funds. Some school districts get that. We actually do not because we're considered property wealthy. So let's talk about the revenue that the district receives by fund type. So about 74% of our revenue is for general and operating expenses. And then we get 6% of our money in federal grants, about 1% in state grant, 4% in child nutrition. And because we recently passed a bond, we get about 15% of that revenue from bonds. And then if you take just the general fund, so I'm going to go back a slide. So you see the blue here where it says general operating, that 74%. If we take that and look at that specifically, 87% of that comes from property taxes, delinquent, current, and associated penalties. So 87% of the money that comes in the district comes directly from local property taxes. About 2% of our revenue comes from the federal government. That is most closely associated with what we do in special education. We do get 10% in state revenues, and that is most closely associated with helping, those are additional funds to help students who are in at-risk situations or part of our state compensatory education program. And then other local revenues, that tends to be either interest earnings or money we make like at gates at football and basketball games and that sort of thing. So how do we increase the amount of money that we get in the general fund, or how does that money decrease? For us, because we are considered property rich in Marble Falls ISD, the most significant way or the easiest way for us to increase our revenue is to increase our attendance. So as attendance goes up, we receive more money because the state funds us on a per pupil basis. I'll explain that more in a couple slides. For many districts, if property values go up, they receive more money. That is not the case in Marble Falls ISD because we're considered property wealthy. As our property values go up, all that really happens is the amount of money that the state takes away from us in the form of recapture increases. So our property values can continue to skyrocket, and it won't really benefit the students of Marble Falls ISD. And then the other thing that the district can do is adjust the tax rate. I'll talk more about tax rates later, but I mentioned earlier that the district has a significant amount of influence over the INS tax rate. That can be increased. It requires voter approval. And we do have some influence over the MNO tax rate, but that is a much more difficult thing to accomplish. But all of those different things influence how much money exists in the general fund. Speaking of tax rates, this year the MNO tax rate's 0.8995 and the INS tax rate's 0.2153. And so this slide gives you a little look about what that looks like on an annual basis for homeowners. So let's talk about tax rate history for a minute. I'd like to look at the graphic on the left. As you will see, this chart, the blue represents the MNO tax rate and the red represents the INS tax rate. Let's talk about the MNO tax rate first. In 2012, it was $1.04. It reached its highest level it got there at 2013 and stayed there until 2019. And then 2020, that dropped to 0.98, and then in 2021, 0.96, and in 2022, 0.89. And that's because of some legislation that came out as part of House Bill 3 in the 86th legislature. And so what I can tell you is that since 2019, the MNO tax rate has decreased. So the amount that the district is influencing on tax rate has actually decreased. The same is true of the INS side. So if you look at 2012, it's gone from a high of 0.25 to a low of 0.2153, which is where it is now. What is notable is that 0.2153 was set at the same time that the district sold $55 million worth of school bonds. And so the school's done a good job of managing our debt in a way that has allowed us to add debt while decreasing the tax burden to the community. And then if you look at the graphic on the right, you would see that the values in the area have increased year over year. You know that because you're feeling it in the amount of money you're paying. Values the district has no control over. Values are set by the Burnett County Appraisal District as well as the state comptroller. And so they determine values. The district sets the INS tax rate. And I mentioned before, the Texas Education Agency basically sets our MNO tax rate now. The district can try and increase that MNO tax rate, but it requires two things. Voter approval, but before we can ask the voters to approve an increase to the MNO tax rate, we would have to go through a state-level audit where they can do an efficiency study and make sure that the district actually can't do things to reduce cost first. And so that is a stop gap to make sure that districts aren't being careless with money. Let's talk a little bit about enrollment and ADA. So I said earlier that the district is funded based on pupils, which is somewhat true. We're actually funded on the number of kids who actually attend school. And so what you'll see on the left-hand side is our enrollment patterns, and you can see it by year. So if you look at the 2016-2017 line, you can see that in that year, we started the first day of school with 4,150 students. In the spring, we reached our apex of a little bit over 4,250 kids, and then it came back down to about 4,225. That's normal. That up-down pattern, as you can see, is normal, and that has to do with early graduations and other issues that have kids come in and out throughout the course of the school year. And you can see our history on enrollment. Now, we're actually funded by the percentage of kids who come to school. So we're funded at roughly $9,000 per student who comes to school. So what they do is they take our enrollment and they look at the percentage of attendance. And our funding is based on that percentage. And so if you look at the graphic on the right, you can see our attendance trends by 6 weeks. And so you can see here that it starts high and tends to taper. And that has to do with a lot of different reasons and issues. Some of it doing with illness and some of it just being the spring. And there's a lot that goes into that. But this pattern that you see here is A, typical for Marble Falls, and B, typical for schools around the state. So we track these attendance trends in a way that allow us to be able to anticipate what we might need to do with the budget. So for example, if we're in a school year where we have a heavy flu outbreak and we have a large percentage of kids out of school, then we'll sometimes make adjustments to our budget mid-year to make sure that we stay within our budget constraints. And on the other hand, if our attendance is unusually high, then we might be able to flow some additional funds into programs that allow our students to have a more enriching experience. And so part of the reason we look at numbers so much on the attendance side is not just the educational aspect, which is obviously our top priority, but it does affect funding. So let's talk about expenditures. Where do we spend our money? We talked about how we get money in. Let's talk about how we spend it. 62% of the money we spend is on general operating. And then we spend about 5% on federal grants, which I know doesn't make any sense, but sometimes we have to manage federal grant cost. 1% state grant cost, 3% child nutrition, 18% is capital projects. So we spend about 18% of our funds right now. All funds, by the way, 18% of all funds are related to our bond programs right now. And then 11% on debt service. So we spend about 11% paying down the debt that we receive from those bonds. So if you think about it this way, that 18% represents the money that we're spending to pay for school improvements, and that 11% represents the purchase of the bonds that are giving us the money we need to those capital projects. That can be a little confusing. If you have any questions about that, please feel free to call us at the Central Administration Building, and we'll be glad to talk you through that. And then if you look at just the general operating fund expenditure, so let's do this again like we did before. Look at this part of this pie graph that's in the darker blue color. It says general operating, 62%. We're going to break that down because that's the part over which we have the most discretion. 61% of that goes out in the form, I apologize. 85% of that is payroll cost. So 85% of the money over which we have the most discretion is paid straight to teachers. If you look at the orange color, the contracted services, that's where we pay Recapture. 7% of that. There's other contracted purchases in there. It's not just Recapture, but that's the biggest chunk of that. Supplies and materials is 6%. Other operating expenditures is 2%. And then capital outlay right now is 0%. And that is because our bond is paying for almost all of the capital expenses that we have in the district right now. What's a capital expense? New buses, new air conditioners, and those sorts of things. Right now our bond is covering all of those costs. And so our general operating fund is not needing to absorb that part of the expenditure. I've talked a little bit about Recapture. I'd like to talk about that a little bit more now. For those of you who are not familiar with Chapter 49, it used to be called Chapter 41, and I left both of those on this slide to help you understand that they're one and the same. So Chapter 49 Recapture, what is a Chapter 41/49 district? Sometimes called Robin Hood. That's the term that most of you are probably more familiar with. This program requires districts who meet this test to send money to the state to be distributed to property poor districts. And so right now, the property taxes that we receive in Marble Falls ISD exceeds the amount of money that the state says that we need to educate children. And so by the amount, that your taxes exceed what the state thinks you need for your kids, that's skimmed off the top and that's sent to other schools, right? So if you'll think about it this way, think about a glass of water, and the state saying, when you fill this glass up, that's all the water you get. But let's say as taxpayers, you're capable of putting more water in that cup than that cup can hold. The state comes in and takes all that extra water and sends it to other parts of the state. So that's what Recapture is, and that's how it works. So one of the questions that's often asked is, how are my taxes going up but schools need money? It's because here in Marble Falls, property values go up, the amount you pay in taxes go up, but we don't actually get the benefit of that. That excess is going to other schools in other parts of the state. And so in a typical year, we send about 10%, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, back to the state from our local property tax collections. I live in Marble Falls ISD, and so there's part of my property taxes that are included in that $4.4 million that we're sending back to the state this year. And so that's one of the things that we're constantly having to manage. And as our enrollment changes and or our values change, the amount of money we have to send back to the state can go up a little bit or go down a little bit. What I will tell you is, since I've been here, the only time it's gone down is because of HB3. And it's steadily starting to go back up again. And Burnett CISD is finally having to start to pay some back into Recapture too. This is typical of Central Texas school districts because our property is so valuable out here. It's not true of all of them, but this is not unusual in Central Texas. So that explains some of what goes on with property taxes, Recapture, and the money that you're paying to public schools, some of which does not stay here. I want to express appreciation to our business office staff. They do a great job every day. Melissa Lafferty is Executive Director of Finance, and you can see those folks who work in her office. We received a superior rating on our 2021 Financial Integrity Rating System of Texas program. That's the highest rating you can get. We are also extraordinarily transparent. At one point, we received the platinum level of transparency with the Comptroller's Office. They got rid of the program that awarded those levels of recognition. Otherwise, we'd still be at that level of transparency. We have on our website our check registry and a tremendous amount of information related to where every dime and every dollar of the district goes. If you ever have questions about that, you should feel free to call 830-693-4357 and ask for Melissa Lafferty or myself, and we can show you where you can find all that information. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this. I hope you share it with others, and I hope it's answered some questions for you. I would tell you that our number one goal is to serve the students and the community of our district with the resources that we have been provided by our taxpayers. We are funded by various resources, which means we answer to various, we're held accountable by different groups, from the federal government to the state government to others. We actually have very little control of how much funding we receive, and most of our costs are fixed, leaving us limited flexibility on how some of that money is spent. And so we talk a lot about money, and I try not to bellyache about us not having enough. I know better than that. But every now and then we get questions about why we don't do certain things, and the answer is because we're a little bit tight on resources. And for some people, that's very frustrating because they see what they're paying in property taxes and they see what's going on in some of the school districts, and it makes them question. And what I will tell you is a lot of it has to do with the Recapture system, and some of it probably has to do with just the uniqueness of some of the things we have going on here in the Hill Country. So thank you very much. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you and taking the time to view this.